Kind of Confusing, Part 2. My name's Joel Duff, and I want to talk to you today about young Earth creationism and walking stick insects. Yes, insects that look like sticks that walk around. In particular, we want to ask the question, what constitutes a walking stick insect? Are they one type of organism? Are they one kind of organism? Thinking of the young Earth creationist view of biblical kinds. So what constitutes a walking stick insect kind? Are there multiple kinds of walking stick insects? Are there dozens or hundreds of walking stick insect kinds that God created in the beginning? Or is there a single kind of walking stick insect, in which case there has been massive, rapid diversification of that original walking stick into the ones we have today? And what did that original walking stick look like in a perfect creation? Are they products of de-evolution? Did they originally not have the characteristics of what we think of walking sticks today? And especially since the characteristic of a walking stick is that they blend into their environment as a form of camouflage to avoid predation. Was that necessary in the original creation? Or is that something that was part of the original creation? So from the young Earth creationist perspective, we're trying to examine the question of what is a kind, what are the limits of a biblical kind, and what does it mean to have variation within a kind, and how do organisms diversify within a kind, if in fact there are diverse organisms within a particular biblical kind. All right, that's a whole lot of stuff to chew on, and we're going to discuss walking stick insects to try to answer some of these questions. But before I do that, I want to go back and explain what my title refers to. I said this is Kind of Confusing Part 2. Well, what was Kind of Confusing Part 1? That was an article I wrote about a year ago, Kind of Confusing Young Earth Creationist Classification of the Bombardier Beetle. In that case, I had a similar question. Bombardier beetles are the Bombardier beetle, often referred to in the singular, is a particular beetle species, or at least it's portrayed as a particular beetle species, which has a very intricate mechanism of combining chemicals to shoot hot acid out of their derrieres at any predator, warding them off. And that particular mechanism has been hailed by a young Earth creationist as a irreducibly complex system that must have been created by a creator. It could not have evolved from simpler parts. And so therefore, one would think that a kind of Bombardier beetle is something that has this capacity. But as we saw in my particular article, the question of what a Bombardier beetle is kind of confusing. Let me get to that in just a moment. But first, let's go back and let's talk about, to introduce you to the idea of the young Earth creationist view of the origin of organisms and where diversity comes from within those organisms. Young Earth creationists believe that the original animal kinds, and we could say kinds of all different life forms, were created about 6,000 years ago in the original six-day creation. They would say that changes within animal kinds are then directed, so any changes that have occurred since then are somehow caused by God, although as we'll see, those are not typically miraculous changes, but are pre-programmed changes from things that God either anticipates in the original creation that will be necessary, or that he is guiding through some natural process, although natural processes are still his processes since he's the author of those natural processes. So another fundamental postulate of young Earth creationists is that no new animal, or really any kinds, have ever evolved. So whatever a kind is, and that's what this talk is defining what a kind is. Whatever a kind is the only kinds that have ever existed. So kinds may have gone out of existence. So for example, we have dinosaurs, right? There's a variety of different dinosaur kinds. We could debate how many kinds there are, hundreds or thousands or a few, but nonetheless, they may have diversified into a few species, but they are all extinct today. So therefore, kinds can disappear, but no new kinds can come into existence. Why is that? That's because modifications that occur in structures, modifications to organisms, only can modify structures that already exist. in the young earth creationist view of the history of life. And therefore, no dramatically new features can come into existence. And since kinds, again, we have to define what a kind is, but the essence of a kind is the similarities of the organisms, so the sharing features. If they were to develop a brand new or radically different feature for an organism, that might actually cause them to no longer be considered part of that kind, in which case you would say that a new kind evolved from another kind, and that's not allowed. Since kinds cannot become other kinds, as again, a basic assumption of young earth creationism. So God has created the original kinds. Maybe we could view those as saplings in a planting little saplings in an orchard. And then as those trees grow, the branches grow out and become multiple different branches over time. And that's sort of this view that maybe God created original species, and those species then, as they populated, and they filled the world, they diversified into different habitats and became diverse, and in this case became diverse, becoming different species within that kind. But within limits, right? They can't go beyond their kind and become another kind of organism. So what are the limits of how much change can happen? That's another open question for young earth creationists. This slide, by the way, comes from a presentation given on Facebook Live from the Creation Museum, in which they're explaining their view of the origin of life. Okay, so now back to the Bombardier beetles before we get to our stick insects. One of the things that I was bringing out in my article, kind of confusing, is that young earth creationists talk about the Bombardier beetle as this highly specialized organism with this very specialized ability, and therefore proof that God must have created this individual separately. This individual, in this case, this species separately. But once you start to look at Bombardier beetles, you realize it's beetles plural. There are 6 genera, and there are 500 different species in those genera that are called Bombardier beetles by beetleologists, okay, out there who study these things. That's because a whole bunch of different species of beetles have this capacity to squirt this hot acid. Now, they don't all have the same exact capacity. Some are more accurate, some produce slightly different chemical versions, but they all use the same kind of gland to do it. But on the other hand, there are other beetles, all right? There are thousands of other beetles that are related to these beetles that have the same glands, they just don't use them for the exact same thing. And so then the question becomes, for creationists, is this particular beetle, which is usually the one talked about when they talk about and show Bombardier beetles and talk about this amazing act of special creative act of God to create this organism, is this beetle related to this one? In other words, do these two share a common ancestor? Or does this one, which also has the same capacity for defense, chemical defense, is it in fact related to this one by common ancestry, or are all these separate creations? Are they separate kinds of organisms? And the general consensus among young earth creationists, although they don't talk about this very much, they don't tell their audience very much about the fact that there's many different variations on this theme of a Bombardier beetle, is that all these probably are actually related. They're the same kind of organism. So God created a progenitor of all these different variants of Bombardier beetles, including Bombardier beetles that are even grouped in a different subfamily, which live with ants and have a very different morphology. Even these sometimes are grouped together. So that's what the kind of confusing thing is, right? Depending on which literature, young earth creationist literature you're looking at, you might be thinking that species are kinds because they're so specialized that how could they possibly have evolved to have come to this point of being so incredibly adapted to their particular environment. But they also recognize that there's so many similarities between these organisms that maybe they all do have a common ancestor, and that their variants, all right, they have diverged over time from a common ancestor, in which case they have evolved from a common ancestor to the points that they are today. And they are So therefore, all of these are really a kind. So what is the limit of a kind? And then, of course, this group of Bombardier beetles is part of a larger beetle family, which also has the same glands and similar features and lives in similar habitats, which includes some 50,000 different species. Maybe those are all of a kind. Maybe they're all the same kind. So where does a kind begin? Where does a kind end? This is what's kind of confusing. And now we want to talk about kind of confusing too. The kind of confusing too is that, hey, newsflash, not breaking news, because most scientists know about this, or biologists would know about this. But I think to the young Earth creationist audience who has been trained up and heard about the Bombardier beetle as this special case, this great example you can go to as sort of a gotcha question. It's like, well, how could that have evolved, that particular thing evolved? Well, it turns out that that particular thing, which is a very highly refined capacity to squirt chemicals as a defense, is not just found in Bombardier beetles, but is also found in other insect groups. And so it's not just bombardiers that can shoot chemicals from glands. It's actually chemical defense overall is very common among insects. Bombardier beetles produce not just squirting chemicals, but foams and mists and sticky substances. So they have other strategies even within the group of Bombardier beetles, which may be a kind or maybe not a kind. Maybe each one is a different kind. But shooting chemicals is, I have to admit, that's less common among insects. But there are many insects that do have the capacity to do so. And that capacity is also found in another order of insects called the Phasmids, the order Phasmatodiae, which has about 3,000 species. The Phasmids, great name, right, are the walking sticks or the stick bugs or the ghost insects. There's two subgroups, and that includes the stick insects here and the walking leaves, and I'll show you a couple walking leaves or leaf insects as well. All of these are called phasmids. There's about 3,000 different species, and embedded within this group of things that mimic sticks, there are many individuals that do chemical defenses, and there are a few species that have the capacity to actually squirt out chemicals at their would-be predators. And I want to introduce you to one of those, and that's Megacrania batasea. They're called the peppermint stick bug or stick insect. And in this case, this stick insect here, in the prothorax region, I think it's right in here, they have a gland that is found in all the different phasmids. So they all have this particular gland. Actually, I think most insects do. That gland is responsible for producing particular hormones that are involved in the process of molting or going through their different life cycles. But they have adapted that particular gland to also house other chemicals, and it basically has a muscular pump that allows them to squeeze their body and shoot out this liquid at anything like a praying mantis that comes along that might want to chew on it. Phasmids, by the way, are not dangerous to you. Well, they squirt acid in your eye, of course, but they're herbivores, so they're eating plants. Generally, they're eating the plants that they're hiding on with their cryptic biology. All right, so I've established that we have a case here of another group of organisms that have similar features. The stick insects have been all put together because they have a similar morphology and they have similar habits. They have similar life cycles. And so it's natural that they would be placed together, classified together. So now our question really is, are all the phasmids a kind of organism? Like, what did God create? In the young Earth creationist model, what did God create during the creation week? Did he create stick insects? And how many did he create? Did he create many different kinds of stick insects, or did he create one kind of stick insect and endowed it with the ability to become many, many, many other stick insects over time as they filled the world? As they obeyed the command to do that. So first, before I get to the creationist writings on phasmids, which won't take long because there's not many of them, I want to give you the conventional view of the origins of phasmids. And that's pretty well summarized in this article in Frontiers in Ecology and Evolution from 2019 by Simon et al. Old World and New World Phasmatody, so the whole world's phasmids. Phylogenomics resolved the evolutionary history of stick and leaf insects. And there's one particular figure in this paper which sums up what we want to learn from about the phasmids from the sort of conventional evolutionary perspective. So first of all, I love this figure because for one thing, it's showing you a whole bunch of the diversity of these. So this, remember, is the order, classified ordinal level grouping of all stick insects. And they come in a whole bunch of different families. So there's lots of different recognized families that have particular features that group them together in the family sense. It's kind of like families are like the canine family, all dog-like things, or the feline family, like all cat-like things. There's lots of different families of stick insects. And then within those families, there are a whole bunch of different genera, and they're just giving you a few of the genera of these 3,000 different species scattered across these groups. And what they've done is they've sequenced genes from all these, and they've just compared the genes and looked at the sequence and see how different they are to develop this phylogeny, which is just a relationship or an illustration of how those sequences are related to each other, or you could just think of it as how similar they are to one another. So what are the organisms we've talked about already? I mentioned the peppermint one here, that's Megacrania right here. There's actually 12 different species of Megacrania. They can't all squirt the chemicals in the same way, but a few of them can, and the one I showed you is the best at it. So they're not all, they don't have equal capacities for that ability. But, oh, by the way, they also smell like peppermint. That the chemical that they make smells like peppermint, so that's where they get their name. And others of this other genus don't smell like peppermint, so they're producing a different kind of chemical. So you can see that there's real differences between these different stick insects, not just in the way they look morphologically. They are matching up to different types of plants and different places in the world, so their cryptic biology is different. But also their internal chemistry is different in how they operate, and certainly their genetics are different. So they've sequenced many genes, in some cases genomes of these organisms, and they are very different from one another. In other words, they have hundreds of genes that are missing or are extra in some of these versus others. So there's large genetic differences between them. So let's keep that in mind when we talk about what is a kind and what are the limits of a kind. And the limits could be the limits of how morphologically different an organism could be to be in a kind, but the limits could also be like how genetically diverse you can be to remain in a what's called a biblical kind. So that's Megacrania. I did want to introduce you to the leaf insects. So here's an example of a leaf insect. This particular leaf insect is found in what all of the leaf insects are found in, this particular family right here. So there's only a few hundred leaf insects. They're all right here. Now I just want to make a note of this because they're most similar to another genus right here in another family that are what are called stick insects. And so they appear to be genetically related to some stick insects more so than other stick insects. All right, so because you could, so the point here is that if you were to say, look, I think the leaf insects or the leaf walkers, all right, are so unique. They certainly look unique compared to maybe the stick insects just on your initial gut. Like I look at them, I see them as being different. If you were to say, like, I think those are a separately created kind of organism. If that's the case, well, they're actually quite similar to some other stick insects. And the stick insects are more different from each other than these leaf insects are from some stick insects. So from a genetic perspective, the leaf insects are simply embedded into the diversity of stick insects. It's like they're just a variation of stick insects. If they were truly different than the stick insects, then what we'd find is they should have been over here. Like, if this was the leaf insects, and then genetically they are suggested to be related by a common ancestor to all the stick insects, and these were all the stick insects down here, You could then make the argument that leaf insects are truly isolated or separated or genetically divergent from the stick insects, and therefore maybe they're a different kind of organism, a separate creation. But as soon as you say that the stick insects, and this is going to be our big question, are the stick insects all one kind? If they're all one kind, that means they share a common ancestor. So right here, and of course they wouldn't agree to that being 120 million years ago. They would say 6,000 years ago there was a type of stick insect. God created the original form, all right, the ideal form of a stick insect. And it couldn't have looked like all of these. It must have been something that had some features of some of these. And then from that you had all of these different stick insects evolved from those essentially into the diversity we have today. And included in that would be the leaf insects, because they are just embedded into the genetic variation of the original founding ancestor of all stick insects. So that gives you an idea for a little bit of an idea of the genetic diversity, morphological diversity, and so now we've set the stage for the question, are stick insects a biblical kind? So were stick insects there from the beginning? A trickier question would be, like, what did this common ancestor look like? So if you agreed that all stick insects are one kind, biblical kind, then what did the original stick insect look like? Potentially it didn't look like a stick insect at all. I mean, maybe it looked like a leaf insect. Maybe it didn't look like a leaf insect or a stick insect. Maybe it just looked like a grasshopper or something like that, all right? And which are related to these as well, if we were to go back farther in time. So if it looked like a grasshopper, maybe from there it then developed all of its stick insect features after that. And so maybe God encoded all the ability to make stick insects into an original organism that didn't look like a stick insect. That's one of the primary questions for young Earth creationists, is what did the original creation look like, when many of the features that stick insects have today are highly adapted and associated with particular necessary things for them to do to survive in today's world. But young Earth creationists would say that the original world was a perfect creation in which maybe there was no death. And then that raises the additional question of, well, what does no death mean? Does death mean that insects even couldn't die? And there's differences of opinions among young Earth creationists about that. If you think that insects couldn't die, then why would they need defensive mechanisms? Like, why do they need to hide? Why do they need to be cryptically colored? All right, because a bird's not going to eat them anyway. They're incapable of dying. I'd say most creationists, though, would say that insects aren't truly living things in the sense like animals are, higher animals, vertebrates, and therefore they could die. I mean, they were food for other animals that couldn't die, and therefore they had the right to try to hide themselves, right? God gave them the capacity to try to protect themselves from being eaten. And so therefore maybe stick insects could have been in the original Garden of Eden, and Adam would have had a hard time seeing them because they were so cryptically hidden in the leaves from other things. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of an idea to what some of the questions are. Now we want to see, like, what do young Earth creationists think about this? Oh yeah, I forgot I was going to just mention that there's a ton of different chemicals been isolated from phasmids, and there's lots of potential actually for drug discovery because of all the unique chemicals they make. So the point here again is each of those species of phasmids makes a special unique chemical assemblage, and if you think about how chemicals are made, they're made with different enzymes that are responsible for the metabolic pathway that generates different chemicals. So if one organism makes one chemical as a defense and another one makes a different one, they must have different enzymes that make those different things. Different enzymes, what makes enzymes? Genes make enzymes. So they have different versions of genes that make different metabolic pathways that make different chemicals. So that's just another indication that these different species of phasmids have different genetics, all right, because they must have different genetics in order to be able to construct different chemicals in their bodies. Okay, so now we got to get to it. What's the what's the history of how young Earth creationists have thought about phasmids. And there's not a whole lot to say here because, like I said, there's only been maybe 2 or 3 people have ever even mentioned walking sticks with any level of detail other than just like, walking sticks are amazing, right? God made them because look how amazing they are. They're able to hide themselves and they have this really amazing ability to match their environment, and only God could have done that. Now that's a very general statement, and really any theist could say that, right? I'm a theist and I could say that God did make walking sticks. Absolutely. He's responsible for the origin of walking sticks. But I might have in mind exactly what that origin looks like might be different than what some young Earth creationists have in mind when they're talking about origin. So what is a young Earth creationist thinking about when they're talking about the origin of a walking stick? Did God just, there's that species of walking stick and they've been the same ever since? Or did God make one original walking stick without any relationship to any other insect, but that walking insect has become 3,000 different kinds of walking sticks. Sorry, I should use the word kind there. 3 different variations of walking sticks that we call species today. Let's look at The Impossible Insects by Joachim Scheven, a German paleontologist. Writing in 1999 in the journal Creation, although republished here by Answers in Genesis. So they call them, like you said, these are impossible insects. And by impossible, of course, this means this couldn't possibly have come by any kind of natural mechanism. God must have made these because they're so amazing. Right? They're the undisputed masters of camouflage in the living world. They come in a bewildering array of forms, and virtually all mimic some part of other various plants. Right? Then has a picture of it in the creation.com or Creation Journal version. Here's a leaf insect, so I just want to show you again. Leaf insect that's blending in with its environment at the same time it's eating the leaves that it's living on to survive. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time with this particular 2 paragraphs of this very short article. According to evolutionary belief, phasmids, right? So I just mentioned what phasmids are, 3,000 different walking sticks, all right, including the leaf insects, are the result of millions of chance mutations filtered by selection. Well, I mean, that's what natural selection does. I mean, that's a description of it. Mutations are variations in organisms, and those mutations are filtered by selection, which selects, depending on the environment, which of those particular mutations best fits or is best for its fitness in that particular environment. It's taught that all of them are descended from a common phasmid ancestor. All right, well, I just did show that to you, right? I showed you a paper where they looked at all the different major groups of phasmids, and they did these genetics, and they tried to point the fact that all the genetics relate to a common ancestor, all right? But if they came about, so that's the evolutionary story, right? That this is natural selection on mutations and over a lot of time, and all these different phasmids are actually related to each other by common ancestor. But if they came about in such a continual gradual process of development and adaptation, how is it that we only ever see the end product in all their exquisite perfection? Now, this is a loaded word, perfection right here. Yes, they are exquisite and they are well adapted to their environment. Well, what does it mean that they're perfect? The connotation here is that this particular insect is so incredibly sculpted for this particular, living on this particular twig, because it looks just like that twig, that it is perfect, all right? It is perfectly fit for that environment. I would push back on the idea of perfection in this sense. Not all walking sticks look exactly like their host or the thing they're living on. And many walking sticks live on multiple different species, and they can't be perfectly adapted to any one of the species, or they won't look perfectly adapted to another species of plant that they're living on. So they're more generalists, right? They fit in, but not perfectly. All right. I mean, you could always look at that stick insect and say, I could do this a little bit better. Like as a designer, I was like, I could fix you so you'd be even better at living on that particular environment. And there are lots of stick insects that are much more generalist, and so just generally have the pattern of the look of a stick insect, but they're not really very good at fitting in, although they fit in well enough that they can survive. And that's really what's important in the natural world. It's not about being perfect, it's about being good enough to make offspring and continue. Nonetheless, the point is that they are arguing, this author is arguing that each one of these species is perfectly adapted to its particular host. All right? How is it that they are so different? One mimicking exactly the common crooked twigs lying on the forest floor, the other a disease-damaged leaf, and the other a rotting system, yet all with the same habit of camouflage. All right? They're all using a form of camouflage to the same degree of perfection. All right? He's arguing that each species is perfectly adapted to different situations in different parts of the environment. Right? And it is amazing that those organisms are adapted to different spots in maybe even the same forest system. You might have 5 different phasmids living on 5 different habitats. They're perfectly adapted. How could that possibly happen? And they're perfect for those situations. But the idea of perfection is that which clearly what the reader of a young earth creationist reader of this is getting the perception from this that, wow, this is just so perfectly adapted. How could that have evolved? How could that have evolved? But if these phasmids are actually related to each other, they're all one kind, and they came from a common ancestor, surely that common ancestor wasn't adapted to every single one of those species. They weren't adapted to the forest floor and a crooked twig and a disease-damaged leaf all at the same time, right? They couldn't have every one of those features all at the same time. And they would have had to gone through some process to go from adaptation to those different environments. In which case, as they're going through that process, they're surviving because they're adapted to this world, but they haven't reached that point of looking really good and perfect for that particular environment. I just used the word perfect. I shouldn't have used that because I don't like that word in this context. What is the probability, even given all the selection in the world, billions of years of selection type of idea, that all the right genetic accidents have occurred, right? You know, mutations are just accidents. So if evolution is just accidents and natural selection, how could that create all these amazing separate lines of organisms? Separate lines would be separate species, right? Each species is uniquely adapted to its situation. I get from all of this the feeling that, and the type of argument here is the same with the Bombardier Beetle. The Bombardier Beetle, and when we're talking about brachynes, like some specific genus or species, is so amazingly adapted to its environment and has such specialized features, God had to have made that. But then when you open it up and you start looking, wait a second, there's a whole bunch of other genera of things that also can squirt these chemicals and are very similar, and they have based on the same kind of mechanisms, but they don't make the same chemicals. So what are you saying? That every one of those is a special creation? And then it's like, well, no. You know, they're not really special creations, each species. They were a kind that had the capacity to do that, and then they explored different options in terms of how they could do that. And so they really do have a common ancestor. I feel like this author is kind of thinking of each species as being a unique creation. But at the end of the day, it's really hard to tell because the language is very fuzzy, because kind is not defined in this particular article. They don't actually say it. Let's go down here. Along with so much in the living world, the phasmids indicate providential, intelligent design. All right, that's fundamentally his argument. This has to be design. This can't be chance. This can't be natural, any kind of natural mechanism that's outside of God's control. Now, stepping back for a second, I mean, any theist would say, evolutionary creationist, old Earth creationist, they're not denying that God's not involved. All right. They're just saying that there aren't necessarily miraculous events happening. I don't even think this author thinks it's miraculous, other than the original creation is miraculous. Okay, well, we'll get to that in a moment. where am I at here? To create something as complex as one of these brilliantly programmed mimics, right? This idea that life is programmed and you have to have a programmer, God. In the beginning, at the beginning, all right, God programmed all these organisms right from the very start. Involves a creator capable of working miracles. This has to be a miracle. Okay, well now here's the rub. Okay, so the original creation, the 6-day creation, those are miracles. God's creating these different things, all right, through processes that are not like processes that are occurring today, right? So they are not obeying the rules that God has established for the way the world functions after the creation in the young Earth timeline model. So he's not saying that later there were miracles that happened, like there's not a miracle happening today and a new stick insect is suddenly forming. And so it's more like, okay, all the stick insects were created by God at the beginning. So what exactly is a kind? I'm really not sure. All right, it's kind of confusing. What does this person actually think God created at the beginning? You could maybe squeeze in the idea here that maybe God created an original version of a stick insect and programmed the stick insect with all the genetic switches and so forth that would be turned on and off, that would create variations that would then become different variations that lived on different kinds of trees and mimicked other things. But that wouldn't be miracles. That's like pre-programming. But then what is the triggers that do that? How does God guide that process? That's the really difficult question, I think, for young Earth creationists, is finding that way of explaining how that pre-programmed stuff would be expressed over time in a changing environment. And I don't even know if that's what this person believes. Maybe they actually believe that each species of stick insect is so special that they're all special creations of God separately from each other and therefore are separate kinds. All right, see, I'm going around and around and around in circles, aren't I? But that's because it's kind of confusing. Gordon Wilson, being interviewed here, actually does study insects, and so he's especially interesting to listen to. And in creation.com in 2008, he's being interviewed, and he's just talking generally about kinds, and I think that's helpful to hear a creationist say this instead of just me saying it. Creation taxonomists, all right, classificationist, they're trying to figure out what kinds are. Like their evolutionary colleagues, fall into distinct camps, depending on whether they like to split things or lump things together. Do you like to put lots of organisms together and call them one kind? Or do you separate out organisms, and at what level do you separate them and call them kinds? And he's saying that creationists are not of one mind here, right? Which is why it's kind of confusing. He considers himself a splitter rather than a lumper. Now, as we're going to see, Answers in Genesis is a massive lumper, right? They put lots of things together and say that's one kind. He would rather put things separately and say, like, look how unique these different organisms are. I don't think these could have all have evolved from a common ancestor, even within a kind, even with the idea of God pre-programming somehow these genetic changes happening to create these variations. There's too much variation there. Going back to the beginning, I was saying, what does it mean that there's limits to a kind? What would constitute the limit? How much can you stretch a kind and make it different before you have to say, I don't really think that's the same kind anymore? But if your assumption is that kinds can't become other kinds, then you have to say there's something that stops how far you can go in those changes. And he's really saying that, I've looked at the natural world, and there's so many unique genetic elements and versions of organisms that I don't think could have evolved from each other. I'm going to split things and say that God created a lot of kinds. And other creationists are saying God only created a few kinds, but then with the capacity for the kind to be much broader in terms of where it could go and what space, morphological and genetic space it could enter into. So he gives the example like camels and llamas, which, like Answers in Genesis and the Ark encounter, would put camels and llamas together and say they're one kind. So on the Ark, just 4,300 years ago, there was only two animals that when they got off the Ark diverged into camels and llamas in different parts of the world. They're one kind of organism. And that, again, harkens back to, well, what did that look like? And what did that organism look like in the original creation? Very different than the modern day animals we're looking at today, obviously. Whereas he's like, maybe I prefer to think of camels and llamas as being different enough that they're actually separate creations. So there are differences of opinions among young Earth creationists as to what constitutes a kind. So last paper, 2018, from the Proceedings of the International Conference of Creation. This is a group that meets every 4 years, and they publish a whole bunch of abstracts and papers from the talks that are given there. And this one was given by Gene Leitner. Gene Leitner's done a lot of work for Answers in Genesis, developing their concept of what a kind is, along with Kevin Anderson from the Creation Research Society. And they wrote this interesting paper, the CRS, which is Creation Research Society, E-Kinds Research Initiative, right? So they have a project to try to figure out how can we identify kinds. All right, where have we been and where are we headed? This is a very intriguing paper. I don't have time to go through the whole thing. I just want to get down to what they say about insects. But they're essentially trying to figure out a statistical, scientific way of figuring out what God's kinds are, all right, what biblical kinds are. You could use the Bible for this, but the Bible gives us limited information. It's kind of confusing in the Bible what a kind is, just from the text itself. It may give you some really broad parameters, but you're still stuck with a lot of questions. So they're saying we need to use some science here to fill in the gaps and maybe give us a scientific method for doing this. So let's look at morphological variation, genetic variation, proteins, and put them all in databases and figure out some way to look at what are our criteria for separating kinds from one another. And here's what they conclude when they look at lots of different organisms across the world. They say, thus, insect baramins is the fancy word for kind here, encompassing an order, all right, ordinal level classification, or a similar high taxonomic level, seem to be consistent with several lines of evidence. So from their thinking, an ordinal level type thing in insects is where a kind is. Now what's an order of insects? Bombardier beetles are just in one family, and they're in a larger family, the Carabidae beetles. And so the order of beetles, which has like 100,000 species, potentially is one kind. God made just one kind of beetle, and then that became 100,000 different beetles. Or in the case of stick insects, if you follow their model here, the Phasmidoideae is one kind, and therefore all 3,000 stick insects came from an original created stick insect. And so any argument that you make about how special like that one peppermint stick one is and the special chemicals it makes and its ability to actually squirt them, whereas the other ones can't, you can't say that's irreducibly complex if that organism evolved from a common ancestor that didn't have that capacity, or at least didn't express that capacity in the original version, and it had to go through lots of manipulation to get to the point, genetic changes in order to get to the point where it could do that. Those are natural mechanisms. And in the young Earth creationist world, they don't really allow for God's immediate intervention in the process, because they say the creation is over after the 6 days. The creation's not continuing. And so therefore, anything that happened from the original created kind has to be either pre-programmed, or it is really the result of mutations that change the kind somewhat, and natural selection, and a whole bunch of other potentially new mechanisms that we haven't discovered yet. I mean, that's, I think, the hope of young Earth creationists, is that they'll find other mechanisms that evolutionists have missed out on to explain why this could happen so quickly over just a few thousand years versus, I don't know if you noticed before with the timeline, before was 65 million years, for all these changes to all these stick insects to have evolved. And if we didn't, let's emphasize it again. Our newly developed statistical tool has used proteomic data, and initial results suggest the level of the kind may be fairly high among insects, suborder to order, which is similar to that found in some avian taxa. They put some birds into orders, like hundreds of birds that are all related to one. Like 1,500 different finches that are all one kind, and so have evolved from one pair of birds that got off the ark just in 4,300 years. That raises the specter of what we call hyper-rapid evolution or hyper-rapid speciation, which is something that young Earth creationists have to contend with in terms of explaining how could all these different species have evolved from a kind in such a short period of time. So if a kind is equivalent to the category of an order or even a family, then appeals to irreducible complexity, they really lose their credibility. Because that irreducible complexity has evolved within a particular kind over time and has expressed itself presently, not necessarily in the original created version. And young Earth creationists have to appeal to rapid and massive morphological and genetic changes in species over short periods of time by mostly unknown mechanisms. Yes, natural selection, mutations can accomplish a lot of these tasks, but no evolutionary biologist would say that they could accomplish these tasks in just 4,000 years. They could not have evolved all these different highly specialized perfections of traits in all these different species of phasmids. Okay, so that's an introduction and an overview, I hope, of the confusing world of understanding biblical kinds for young Earth creationists. Thank you very much for listening.